Hey guys, welcome. We are here at Britannia Mines with the one, the only, Derek.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for having me, Daryl. Hey, everybody!
Thanks, guys.
Oh, it's been way too long since I've done a live stream. Thank you so much for joining us. We're standing here in historic Mill number 3, maybe my favorite part of the mine site. What do you think? As cool as when you were last year?
This thing is absolutely amazing.
Oh, the views are incredible, and I understand that just before we did this, you were taking a little bit of drone footage from the exterior that's going to show up on your channel later.
It's going to be you guys.
Oh, it's going to show up on both of our channels.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. No, this thing is just epic. Like, if you get a chance, you guys got to come check it out.
So Britannia Mine Museum is a signature attraction out here by the town of Britannia Beach. Before we go any further, I also want to acknowledge that the site on which we're standing is on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish Nation. And I feel truly privileged to be able to deliver this talk from this space and to enjoy the magnificent views, both of the architecture that's here, as well as of the natural light that's pouring in through the massive windows in this building.
Yeah, it's amazing. It really is.
So Britannia Mine Museum is a historic site that has operated in a few different forms, but has basically been accessible to the public in one form or another ever since the old mine here closed in 1974.
Okay.
I'm sure there are some folks that are out there who are people who have connections to the mining industry, and if you're super interested in learning about this part of British Columbia's history, or you're really into machinery, engineering, architecture, definitely those aficionados find a lot of cool things at our site. But one of the things that surprised me when I joined this team last fall is that someone who's, confession, a little bit of a newbie to the engineering and mining world, there was still so much content here that really resonated with me. Daryl, I know I gave you the full tour when you last came out to our site. What stuck out to you most when you visited us?
I remember as a kid driving by this place and seeing broken windows, graffiti, and coming to it now, seeing what I always was curious as a kid, what's in that building? Coming into this building and just seeing, it's breathtaking. It really is.
No, the mill is definitely an iconic part of the sea to sky skyline.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when they're driving by, don't realize that when you purchase a ticket to get museum admission, you don't just get to walk up to this building, you actually get to come inside and see it. The mill's been considered a National Historic Site since 1987 because of both the amazing architectural work that created this shape, but also because this was a really innovative space that would push the mining industry forward and give people better technology to extract minerals from some of the mixed rock that's found in this mountain.
Okay.
All right, and Daryl, I'm going to give you a pop quiz, if that's
dear.
okay. All right, let's see how well I did the first time I toured you around here. What was the element that they extracted out of this mine? What kind of mine was Britannia?
Well, you've got gold mining out there.
It's
but
true.
It's not gold.
You can pan for gold at our site, but that's true. By the time this mine opened, a lot of the gold rush activity in British Columbia had kind of petered out, which was good for the company because it meant that there was quite an available workforce. A lot of people looking to get rich quick on the next big mineral discovery.
I'm going to say copper.
Copper. All right. Has he got it? What do we think, commentators?
Yes.
Yeah,
no?
You got it. Copper is the big one. Now, when I think a lot of people think about copper, they go, oh, really? You know, if gold is for loonies and copper is for pennies, isn't copper kind of not as good? And, I'll level with you. If any of you come to our site and you find some gold, I'm happy to split it with you for a finder's fee.
Hey, gold's at a high price right now, too.
Exactly. We'll always take gold. We love gold. If they found any gold in here, they were sure to keep it as well. But copper was also an excellent discovery because huge quantities of it were needed in the time when this mine first opened.
Yep.
People began exploring the mountain on which this mill building now sits. searching out for any valuable elements. And pretty quickly, they discovered some evidence that copper could be present potentially in really high quantities if they could get deep enough into that structure. Now, copper's been important to people for thousands of years. It has been used for, well, a lot of things that start with the letter P, curiously. Pots, pans, pipes, pennies as well. Paintings. In fact, coming up on September 18th, we have an art festival called Copper and Fire, where local artists who use copper as their medium are going to be setting up some temporary displays.
That would be really cool.
It's really neat. I had no idea that it was such a versatile medium.
Yeah.
However, great as all those uses were, the P word that was most important for the mine was power. Because in the 1880s, 1890s, and beyond, people were getting really hungry for access to electrical equipment. And copper is one of the most conductive materials in the world. In fact, amongst all of the elements, only silver is better at transmitting electrical messages, and silver is a little less practical to use and a little more expensive to get access to. For that reason, a lot of copper wire in that time, and for that matter, a lot of copper wire today, is still produced because it is the most efficient conductor that is widely available.
So how much copper was actually pulled out of here?
Okay, I'll confess, I'm not great with numbers. I hear 1 million tons, I hear 1 billion tons. I don't really know how much this is. So I'm going to use a little analogy instead. Take your pointer finger, and I challenge all of you to do this at home as well, and then take your thumb and connect the two to form a circle. Imagine that you're holding onto a wire that is as wide as that circle. If you were to take all of the copper that came out of this mountain when the mine was operating, you'd be able to stretch your wire and wrap it around the planet Earth about 8 times over.
Wow.
That's a lot. And that means that in the history books, Britannia will go down as an incredibly productive copper mine. For a while, it was the single largest producer of copper anywhere within the British Commonwealth. And that because of this element that was extracted from the mountains, people were able to gain access to electric wiring and were able to enter the electrical age and use all kinds of different forms of technology in ways that might not have been possible without that massive influx of copper on the market.
So was this the only mine, like locally?
There were lots of other copper mines, both in the area and, of course, many others of significance further south in North America, in parts of South America as well. However, one of the things that made Britannia so well placed is that here the copper mine was located right by the waters of Howe Sound.
Yep.
So if they could get into it and drill enough tunnels into the mountain to extract high volumes of that copper, they would then process it here in the mill building, and right next door, you've got access to the Pacific Ocean, and you can ship it in those high quantities just about anywhere in the world. Copper is kind of a tricky element. On its own, small quantities of it don't command sky-high prices. But if you've got a buyer who needs a lot of copper to make a lot of wire all at once, Britannia was in many ways perfectly positioned to deliver on that need. And that also means that although this mine is located here in Britannia Beach along the Sea to Sky Highway on the edge of British Columbia's iconic coastline, not all the copper by any means was used locally. Whoever was paying the best price for it was going to get access to it. So Britannia copper ended up in many areas that touch the Pacific Ocean.
So it wasn't specifically just used for electrical. It could have been used for many different things, pennies to roofing to whatever, yeah.
Correct, a huge variety of different reasons. And of course, we still use copper for many of those different reasons today. At that point as well, copper recycling was not something that was possible with the technology that was available in the early days of this mine. So if they wanted to make new stuff with copper, they had to extract and mine new stuff. Nowadays, it's a common misconception that we rely entirely on recycled copper. We have not gotten to the point where we have fully weaned ourselves off of copper mines. Many copper mines remain active today and are really important in supplying the world with that material. But a significant portion of the copper that you were probably encountering in your technology probably was recycled. It has turned out to be one of those elements that happily can have multiple lives throughout.
So what made, like, what I remember as a kid, it being abandoned. So who took the initiative to say, you know what, let's give this building a new life and make it into a museum?
Well, the story of the copper powering technology is just one of the legacies of this place. While it's true that the people who first invested in that company, the company's owners, would make their money back many, many times over, it was also the case that the people who were working in the mine tunnels, working in the mill, working in the buildings that are now historic buildings still on our site, were also, in many cases, earning very competitive wages for those time periods, building skills that were widely able to be transferable. For many folks, part of what would draw them to this community and draw them to the world of mining was the promise of a very stable wage. And some folks, after staying here for just one season, would walk away with enough savings to pay off debts or to plan to look after their families or to start their own business ventures. But that economic situation where the earnings for the workers would often be so competitive that people would be lining up to try to get jobs here. It led to many folks not just being seasonal, them sticking around with the company, gaining those skills and experiences, and also setting up roots and creating a community. The town sites that supported this mine include what is now Britannia Beach, as well as a town site called Mount Shear, which is no longer occupied.
Okay.
At their peak, those two town sites comprised more than 2,000 full-time residents.
Wow.
And between the two spaces, there was not only a school, a church, lots of individuals with homes, of course, but there was also amenities like an outdoor pool and a bowling alley. For the time, in this part of British Columbia, this was a pretty happening place. Part of the reason that the mine's story was preserved is, I think, because of the people who invested in that community, who created the heart of that community. When the mine closed in 1974, that community shrank. A lot of people had to go elsewhere to find a new source of income. But the people who stayed behind, as well as some people who couldn't stay but still wanted to make sure that story told, worked to ensure that a not-for-profit organization would be formed that would preserve some of these historic buildings and make sure that the historical importance of this area would be told to people in the future, even if no more mining was going to be taking place.
So when did they decide to do all this? Was it the 90s?
So while the museum as we know it would not be recognizable if you were to go back in time to the day after the mine shut down, essentially, as soon as that happened, a couple of organizations were formed who started the process of figuring out, okay, what are the contracts going to be? How do we make a deal with the government, with the people who have contractual access to the land? What's it going to take to retain some level of access to the public for this space? And gradually, after those buildings were emptied out of equipment that was still usable in other parts of the industry, there were some fairly early curation steps that were taken to ensure, okay, this is going to be important. This can be used for public access. The mill has also been in a variety of states through that period. Initially, interestingly, more of the museum experience was located on some of the upper levels of this structure. However, as the years went on, one of the challenges for this mill building is that it requires a lot of maintenance.
And safety would be a huge issue.
Correct. Yeah. So nowadays, by modern standards, there are some challenges like the fact that those railings that you might be able to see in the background behind us are the right height for building code in the 1970s when the mine closed, but would need some significant upgrades in order to get the public up there. However, thanks to a major investment project to regain more access to this building, which began in the early 2000s, we're once again able to host programming in here. And since 2019, have even added an interactive special effects show called Boom, which brings back some of the lights and sounds of the mill in a way that I think is a lot of fun.
Cool. Because I imagine this area was not open like this.
Oh, no. shocker, when the mine was open, they didn't have, an interview stage in mind for the lowest levels of their giant factory. Let's talk a little bit about what this mill did when it was active. So if we think of the mine as this massive tunnel system, a network of more than 200 kilometers of tunnels that were dug into the mountain for the extraction of copper, what the miners were able to find was rock that had a high percentage of copper inside. But unfortunately, that copper was not pure. Even if you go into the tunnels today, you wouldn't find copper that looks like a penny. All of the copper that was, I should say, the majority of the copper that was used was in the form of chalcopyrite, a compound where copper is bonded to iron and sulfur. Some of you might recognize the word pyrite because it's also commonly referred to as fool's gold. So iron plus sulfur is fool's gold, iron plus sulfur plus copper is chalcopyrite. And although it's not as convenient as pure copper, they would have been pretty foolish to abandon the project when they realized that was there. Because building this mill was all about taking those rocks filled with a copper-containing compound, breaking them up, and refining technology that could get the pure copper out of them.
But this building is massive. This thing's got to be a good, 20 stories?
About the size of a 20-story building, yeah. Although, because of course, here the machinery is so big, it's really 10 separate floors with really high ceilings.
So why do they need a building so big?
The challenge of breaking down those rocks is, man, ever tried to lift a rock? Those things are heavy, and transferring them between layers of machinery, because oftentimes there were multiple steps in the breakdown process, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of work, and costs a lot of money. So this building was designed with the power of gravity in mind. If you've ever driven by the mill, or if you've looked at the footage that we've shared earlier, the mill has kind of this staircase-like shape. Ore carts would take the mixed rock. In miners' lingo, you would call it ore if it contained the good stuff, in our case, the chalcopyrite. And those ore carts would come out of the mine with masses of mixed rock in them, going into the very top of the building. The first machines on the earliest levels might just be designed to break those ore pieces up. And then the resulting remnants are dumped using gravity, so small amount of energy, between the floors to the next level of machines, which might break them down further or might begin a chemical separating process.
Okay.
Now, I'm no physicist, so you'll have to forgive my lack of precision in this explanation. But copper has different properties from other elements, like the iron and the sulfur that we want to separate it out from. Not to mention all of the other mixed rock pieces that are not valuable or involved at all, but might be trapping that stuff in the mountain space. The key for the people who worked at this mine was to find a solution to getting just the copper out and extracting it with as much purity as possible. Because every element will respond differently in distinct surroundings. It has its unique boiling point, it has its unique melting point, it has a unique point at which it starts to float when it's in certain solutions. Through a lot of trial and error, this is one of the places where some amazing engineers and scientists figured out, okay, what is the exact combination of oils and the exact temperature that we need to raise them to, where if we dump this mixed rock in at a fine enough powdered concentration, that it will cause the copper to float to the surface, and everything else will kind of be stuck in suspension lower down in that mix. So then you can skim pure copper off the top. It's really ingenious.
So in other words, they're loading everything from the very top.
Exactly.
So this is like a big sluicing machine that's not going anywhere, but everything's coming down, being broken down, all the way till you get your copper near the bottom here.
Exactly. And those lowest levels of machinery are breaking it down at that point, not using machines that are smashing the rocks apart, but by using these bubbling vats where separation kind of at the microscopic level is happening using those properties. And then the end result, when it worked right, was that what you could skim off the top was basically this concentrated powdered copper cake. Now, it still was not 100% pure. It would then be sent off to a smelter, which was located off-site, but it was close enough to pure that people would still pay top dollar for it. And that copper concentrate product, which could then be cooled and shaped into bricks, was the main output of the mine that would be sent out onto house sound.
So is that the reason for the big lime machine or the big lime? Well, I don't know what you want to call it, but that big bucket that's out there.
Oh, absolutely. We have a massive lime tank that's still part of the site, and giant vats like it were once much more present within this mill. Again, a lot of them were still perfectly good, so when the mine company closed down in '74, understandably, they wanted to recuperate some losses so they could be sold off to other active spaces. A few of them still do remain and make some great historic artifacts. And hey, I can't argue with the atmosphere that the empty space provides, especially when it comes to giving me a nice platform to do some interviews.
Okay. I mean, just seeing the way the concrete was poured against the rock, and what is this, lime or not limestone, but I'll drawing a blank.
There's a whole bunch of mixes of rock. I seem to recall. Oh shoot! This is not tough, but it's close to
It almost looks like
TUFF.
almost looks like shale in some ways. But yeah, limestone's very soft.
If you're a geologist with a better sense of what's in these spaces, call me up, okay? We'd love to have you. And to my assistant curator, Heather, who is a geologist, if you're watching, hi, Heather, let me know what's in the rock when you email me tomorrow.
So, can we go up there?
You know, I would love to take you up to some of those higher levels of the mill. Unfortunately, exploring the upper levels of the space is a significant liability challenge. There are quite a few spaces in that area where if you sort of walk a step backwards, you could find yourself falling down into some of those chutes that were used to sand copper.
Safety and everything else, yeah.
One of our hopes is that eventually some more private guided behind the scenes tours to upper levels of the mill will be available to the people who write that on your surveys at the end of your visit. I see you, I hear you, we're working on it, but there are definitely some more logistical hurdles that we're going to be looking to clear. We had hoped to include some of those renovations and revitalizations as part of this package, but the first priority for the revitalization of the mill was reinforcing the entire building for earthquake proofing to make sure that it's safe to be in here, getting the exterior, including what was at one point hundreds, if not thousands, of broken windows that needed to be replaced, upgraded, and then to establishing the platforms that we're standing on now, as well as the boom show. The past couple of years, we've been focused a little more on the day-to-day operations of running a tourism organization in, shall we say, some unprecedented times.
Yes.
But those behind-the-scenes opportunities are very much something that we all want to work toward. And we're excited about what that's going to look like. I will say I have scaled to the top of this building myself. And in fact, if you check out our channel, later this year, you'll be able to see some behind-the-scenes videos of what that looks like.
Cool.
Keep an eye out for any of the times when you can see on my forehead that I'm going, don't fall in, camera guy, don't take another step back. So a little more work to do.
So being this is a heritage site, everything was brought back heritage, as much as heritage possible, right? Does that help you at all? Like with,
I think that there's a real authenticity to being in particularly a space like this one where you can look around and feel like you're immersing yourself in that history. Some people will see the mill building and can imagine themselves back in the 1920s when this structure was built. This mill, by the way, was the third one in the mine's history and was built to replace one that burned down in 1921. So it was by far the largest and biggest upgrade to that infrastructure. But some people also remark when they hear that they're a little surprised that this building's not even 100 years old. In some ways, because of the rock behind us, which still does contain reactive elements. There may no longer be enough copper in here that I could make any money off of mining it, but there is enough that it can cause reactions that create some of the beautiful colors behind us, but that also result in rusting and degradation to some of that equipment.
You can kind of see it over in the corner over there. You can kind of see some of the greening and of that like once it starts to weather.
Any of that sort of turquoise or teal tone. I'm not sure if we can pick it up if you're watching, but when you come on site, keep an eye out. Any of that staining that resembles a penny that's gotten wet is a good sign of the remaining copper that's in the walls.
So if the old building burnt down, this must have taken forever to rebuild.
I think it was about 18 months of construction, astonishingly, which is a great measure of just how much money was moving around in the 1920s. When this mine had a mission, where there was a will, there was a way. And getting access to that copper, particularly in that decade, it was really in demand. But while for some folks it's really easy to recognize those triumphs, I think to some other people the mill has taken on maybe a little bit of an eerier atmosphere. There's no doubt that I see some visitors come inside and you sort of see on their faces this look of, all this was left behind.
Yeah.
And I think that it's also okay to take away from seeing this space that this building can be at once a reminder of the amazing impact of technology, and also sort of a monument to a community that built around this resource that then shrank considerably when that natural resource ran out. The community of Britannia Beach are an amazing group of people, tremendously proud of this history, tremendously resilient. There's no doubt, however, that Britannia Beach operates on a much smaller scale than it would have when the mine once operated. And there is among some residents still that feeling of a community that was left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a legacy that we want to tackle authentically as well. Sustainability is something that we think about a lot within our organization. And frankly, since we're talking about copper and its impact on the building, we should also address that not all of the legacies of opening a mine here were positive ones.
No.
As I mentioned before, the waters of Howe Sound are located right in the backyard of this building, which makes for some spectacular views. But if in 1904, the idea of operating a mine right by access to the Pacific Ocean was seen as a pure advantage, in hindsight with 2020 vision, it created a massive pollution problem, and one that didn't end when the mine closed in 1974. Back when the mine operated, there was a recognition that copper and other minerals would leach through any areas that rainwater could touch.
Yeah.
This reaction, known as acid rock or acid mine drainage, is really well understood to environmental scientists today. Many people don't realize that not only was it present at Britannia's mine, this was actually one of the sites where this phenomenon was first extensively described and published on. So again, think back to 1904. There were no environmental laws or regulations in Canada for people operating these structures. So some of this stuff was being discovered at the same time they were figuring out just how to get into and access this technology. Unfortunately, while a little bit of copper that's naturally occurring in this rock has always leached out into the waters of Howe Sound, when you take dynamite and blow 200 kilometers worth of tunnels into it, that reaction has way more surface area to take place, and it becomes stronger and stronger. Interestingly, when the mine was operating, they did have a system to remove some of that copper from water that would otherwise leach into Britannia Creek and then spill into the waters of Howe Sound. To be fair, I think that that copper laundering system was as much about trying to capture every bit of copper that they could while they had access to it, as at least as much as it was about preventing pollution in the area. But I do want to be fair to the company operators. They met all of the regulations and in some cases exceeded them for the time that they were operating the space.
Yes, times have changed.
For sure.
And it's good to see that, you know, nowadays things are held more accountable. But back then they didn't know any better.
And I think that British Columbia, as a space that was in many ways one of the forefronts of the growth of the environmentalist movement and our food for thought, has a really interesting case study in Britannia's mine as a space that we can look at. After the mine closed down in 1974, a few years later, the remaining copper laundering system began to fail, and increasingly there was greater awareness of just how much that pollution was impacting the waters off of our coast. Britannia Creek was unable to sustain many complex animal life forms, and where it poured into Howe Sound, not even barnacles and mussels seemed to be able to survive in those tidal areas. In fact, over time, the Britannia pollution problem would come to be known as probably the single worst case of metal contaminants entering aquatic ecosystems anywhere in Canada. I'm happy to say, though, that that particular legacy has changed. In 2006, a water treatment plant, now run by EPCOR, became fully operational, and it has succeeded in removing the vast majority of the metals released by acid rock or acid mine drainage so that they don't get into Britannia Creek and don't make their way out to the waters of Howe Sound, where they can cause devastation to that ecosystem. In fact, depending on the numbers that you use, it's estimated that well between 90 and 99% of metal contaminants never make their way out of the mine and can be completely redirected because of the way that treatment center was created.
So is there, you still get some of that now, even though it's not operating? You still get some of that?
Unfortunately, this is one of the tricky parts of the mine. It's sort of like a genie that you can't put back in the bottle.
Yeah.
For as long as that open surface area is there, and as long as British Columbia gets rain, water's going to get in and that reaction is going to happen. So today, a big part of the solution was plugging some of the exit points for that water, flooding the old tunnels, with the exception of the small chamber that's still available today that we show off to our guests on tours. And then redirecting all of the water that fills that flooded mine so its only escape path takes it through the water treatment center, where it can be chemically and then physically treated to remove those harmful contaminants, isolate them in an inert form that won't just dissolve and release things like copper again when it's hit by rainfall. And then interestingly, that sort of sludgy inert mix can be used to plug some vacant spaces toward the top of the old mine. So it's like you're creating a product, and because of the way that the mine was built, you're creating a home for it. And there is decades and decades of space for that to continue to go on, which is really amazing to me. Nowadays, this would be considered one of the model remediation spaces for a former mine that found a way to address ongoing pollution issues. And that's a legacy that I think all of us can be proud of, that this wasn't just a space that was left to be abandoned, where people didn't just throw up their hands and say, well, the company's closed, what can any of us do now? But there was participation both from the private sector and from the public sector, and stakeholders worked together to find something that could bring back some of that life to the creek and to Howe Sound. It worked so well that just 5 years after that water treatment plant began operations, salmon started coming back up to Britannia Creek, which is an amazing achievement. Although you could also say that it pretty clearly says, yeah, the problem is exactly the one we suspected that it was, that the mine's pollution going out into that creek was what was preventing things like that from happening again.
So you said that you flooded all the old tunnels, but there's still one that remains?
Correct. The tunnel chamber that we have access to on our tours was absolutely used in the days of the mine, but it was a key one mostly for servicing the second mill, the one that burned down. That's why that chamber is a little bit shorter, which is great for me that in the summer season, if one of the kids runs off from my tours, there's not another 200 kilometers of tunnel for me to search through. I also note, I hear a lot from visitors who get claustrophobic really easily, that while you do get to enter an authentic underground mine space, sunlight is never too far away on our tours. And I've had lots of great feedback from folks who were concerned that they couldn't make it through, that it's a little gentler than they expected. That tunnel was actually sealed off as well for a time. It wasn't really needed after the second mill burned down. But in an interesting twist of history, It was reopened in the 1940s, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Britannia was at that point still considered to be a location of such strategic value that there was concern that if aerial bombings were to occur in British Columbia, this could be one of the sites that was targeted, and the people in town would need a massive bomb shelter space. And I'm happy to say history did not turn out that way. That was probably more precaution, definitely more precaution than might have been needed, but worked out great for the museum later, because then we had a convenient near surface tunnel that was in excellent condition that could be preserved. And because it's not connected to the remainder of the rest of the mine, the limited amount of rainwater that gets into our space is not a significant contributor to that acid mine drainage problem.
So to access the tunnel, you climb up, you walk through, how do you get to it? How do you go through it?
Well, once you purchase admission at our site, going through the tunnel that we use involves a roughly 5-minute train ride, which I know for especially a lot of our younger visitors is one of their favorite parts. We run these trains fairly frequently over the summer high season, as much as every 30 minutes during opening hours. It's always best to try to book a spot online beforehand if possible. 24 hours in advance notice will often give you a chance to pick your time slot, make sure that all of your group come in together. Certainly, particularly on weekdays in the off season, we often have the ability to accommodate walk-ups, but particularly with public health rules changing on a regular basis, advanced planning is often rewarded at tourism sites around I think just about everywhere in the world at the moment. So if you have the ability to, planning ahead is the best way to guarantee you'll be on the train that you want to access. As for the remainder of the tunnels that have been closed off, they are totally inaccessible. In fact, you would need a set of scuba gear in order to do any real exploration of that space. Yeah, it's kind of cool to think about. I've always often wondered if you can figure out how to send one of your drones underwater. I'd, in some ways, love to get some views of what's going on within those spaces.
A little sub drone. That'd be cool.
For our next video.
Always a challenge.
However, again, I'll reiterate that the tour component is available for all visitors who come to the Britannia Mine Museum. The original 200 odd kilometers of tunnels that are now flooded are not accessible even to staff members like myself, which is an important part of the remediation for the area, and also an important way of kind of discouraging that sort of temptation of treasure hunting behavior that I think some people think of when they think about old mines. Those tunnels were, of course, as safe as was possible for the people who worked within them, but careful protocols and supervision were required. It would be a really bad idea for any would-be spelunkers to be tempted to explore any old mine spaces here or anywhere else.
So you've got the big dump truck out there too.
Yeah.
How many of those things did they have going?
So the Wabco truck that's out there was not actually used on the mine itself, but other large pieces of equipment that are similar to it could be used to transport machinery. That donation actually came once the organization was already a museum. One of the interesting things is that Britannia Mine Museum has changed names and changed identities a few times. For a while, we were known as the British Columbia Museum of Mining, and more of our mission focused on telling the stories of mining technology, past, present, and future. This is also something that we still love doing, and engaging people about the search for natural resources. But more of our mission now focuses maybe a little bit less on the broader reach of the industry and engages a little bit more with the specific history of this particular space. And as somebody who's passionate about place-based learning, I think that that's been a really interesting direction, so that our school programs sometimes emphasize more of that social history element than some of the engineering side.
Well, as soon as you enter, I mean, you've got all this education. You're showing like the mining processes and all those rocks and stones and precious materials and minerals that you're finding. It's just, it's amazing.
And since that's such a wide world, to be honest, I often find that, especially since a lot of our audience may not have a lot of background knowledge in mining, it can be helpful to use these tunnels as such a specific starting point. And even if we looked only at copper mining, only at Britannia's site, only for the years that this mine operated, with the official company forming in 1904 and then closing in 1974, so 7 decades later. Within that period of time, the changes to technology were unreal. We're talking about the earliest people here drilling into the walls using drills that you held in one hand and hammered in with the other. And by the end of this time here, you've got people using battery-powered headlamps, people using compressed air-powered machinery that can make holes in the wall that would have taken days to achieve in the old ways. Equipment that can be used not just to blast open those tunnels, but to take intricate samples from different areas and help to trace the concentration so that they could know that they were not only heading towards some good treasure within that mountain, but that they were contributing to a network that would bring them through a sensible pathway to find the next vein after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. If to some extent there was a lot of luck involved in the early mining phase here at Britannia, by the time the company closed, this was an incredibly sophisticated and technologically proficient operation. And that mirrors not just the work that was done by the people here, but the changes that went on in the mining industry as a whole, as this post-industrial explosion of technology and knowledge would change every part of our lives.
Interesting.
And I think that that's an important part of the tone we want to capture here. Yes, many of these buildings are old, but Britannia was a major site of modernization as a mine that had access to a lot of resources just at the time a lot of this technology was booming. It was able to be a kind of front runner. It had access to things quite early on. The newest, best, brightest toys and gadgets were often able to be incorporated here. So while some of those devices are now kind of rusty when you visit our machine shop, it's neat to be reminded that they were state-of-the-art, cutting edge when this mine opened. If anything, however, the fact that this building is the way that it is now is also a reminder that that cutting edge only lasts for so long. There's still actually a fair bit of chalcopyrite left in the mountain of Britannia, but eventually changes to the availability of that technology, reduction in demand for those materials, would all contribute to Britannia gradually losing its competitive edge and eventually hitting a point where it couldn't do what other mines were doing as well, based on what was available within this area, and that there was no longer sufficient demand to make the rather expensive way that they did do things here, getting that chalcopyrite out, using the milling process to extract it, and still make a profit.
Interesting. So being in the mine and the grounds and stuff like that, would most people have lived like around it or on site, or?
For a long period in Britannia's history, there was no sea-to-sky highway. So if you were commuting, you were doing it by boat. That's also another big reason that the communities of Britannia Beach and the townside of Mount Shear flourished so much. Your coworkers were your neighbors. If you were going to be in here for the long run, you were bringing your family over. And there was a remoteness to the community that meant that, in many ways, you did have to form close bonds. You did have to be tightly knit with the people that you worked with, the other people who lived on the town site. So one of our buildings, the Britannia Story, which sits in the old administration building that was used by the workers here, tells a lot of the stories of the community. And there's some amazing footage taken from, I think, the early 1930s of people going out for a May Day celebration, and of a community tradition where one woman from the community would, as elected by the children of the town, be crowned Copper Queen and be given a little tiara.
Oh, that's cute.
There's a fabulous picture. I wish I could take you over to see it, of this grinning woman sitting on the throne, and then around her, maybe it's because cameras, were kind of annoying to work with in those days, but every other woman in the picture has this sour expression on her face, like, I can't believe those rotten kids didn't vote for me.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's America's Next Top Model or RuPaul's Drag Race or whatever you want. Version 1.0.
Exactly.
The rough draft.
That's what started it all.
Yeah, completely. And I love that, although, the world has changed, access to the highway has really globalized this area a lot. I for one, commute in from East Vancouver every day, so I'm guilty of not having too many of those close community connections that were once the heart and soul of this place. But it's nice that we have a place to store some of those stories, to keep some of those videos, pictures, anecdotes, artifacts from those days present, to remind people what it would have been like if you were living in this place that suddenly had this explosion of activity when this became the go-to mining town on the coast.
So here's a question which you might not know. I don't. When did they open the Sea to Sky Highway so that they had that access?
Google, anybody?
Exactly. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a good one for phones. Do we have somebody off camera who can grab that for us in a moment?
No.
Certainly it was not in the earliest heyday of the mine, where arguably that period in the 1920s was what made Britannia.
And that's why I was kind of curious if that road, some sort of the road, was open in the late stages of this.
Yes, there was definitely significantly more access by the time the mine closed down. However, interestingly, the town's population actually peaked in the late 1960s, by which point some of the mine's productivity was already on the decline.
Okay.
It's always interesting to think about the history of kind of community succession, but by that point you'd had enough generations of people laying down roots and enough resources around the town that maybe if you weren't even as connected to the mine, this space was starting to grow beyond that. However, when the mine closed down, it really put a lot of that growth to a halt. In the years that have followed, Britannia unfortunately has lost several of its resources. The company store that once serviced this town closed down, meaning that people have to drive into places like Lions Bay or up into Squamish in order to get access to goods. That said, there is a very cool development project going on across the road. Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see what it'll be like as some townhomes go into the nearby spaces, and maybe, just maybe, for the patient folks of Britannia Beach, some of that community growth could be in the forecast as demographics change. Not to mention, as so many of us have realized in the past couple of years, that there is just no substitute for square footage when it comes to quality of life. And there are limited amounts of that left in some of the more popular areas. So who knows what the next big bustling community is going to be.
So speaking of square footage, you got a lot of, kind of spooky, haunted, creepy stuff here. Like, this would be perfect for some movies. Like, has anyone ever shot in here?
Oh, there's been tons of films that have used Britannia's mill in particular. And the fact that a night shoot in the tunnels, which makes a perfect spooky cave scene, is also a possibility. It's just the icing on the cake. If you're in the film industry and you're looking for a space to do some horror stuff, you look us up, BritanniaMineMuseum.ca. Sorry, pandemic rules. I got to hustle.
Feel free.
If you're interested in seeing a couple of sequences, if you're a streaming junkie like me and you love binging old TV shows, one of the X-Files episodes in early season 3 has some great shots for the monsters hiding out here in the mill.
Oh, cool.
I guess the next generation version of that is Supernatural, which did an episode here. For the people who are really into the grown-up movies, the slashers, the R-rated stuff, one of the Friday the 13th flicks it does have sequences here in the mill.
Really?
It's number 8, and what kills me is that its subtitle is Jason Takes Manhattan. And I'm guessing At least for those sequences, that Jason Goes to Squamish was a better title. Maybe that wouldn't have looked as good on the poster.
You see it all the time, like Vancouver, but it's got a Seattle title or whatever.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Like...
I don't care, Manhattan. If you say so, Mr. Voorhees. I don't want to leave the kids out either, since I know those are, maybe not as age appropriate for some of our viewers. So something that a lot of kids have run forward to let me know is that this is apparently one of the key shots for a Disney show called The Descendants.
Really?
I think it's about the offspring, the kids of some of the Disney villains. And yeah, wouldn't you know, the poor mill building's going to get a self-esteem complex that it's always the bad guy's lair where the monsters hang out.
But you said they've shot in the caves as well, right? Or that cave.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes the historic buildings will be used as well.
That's cool.
And one of the spaces that uses a variety of areas, including quite rarely some exterior shots of the mill, is the second live-action Scooby-Doo movie.
Oh, cool.
And I think that it just made its way onto Canadian Netflix. So
I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, if you go through some sequences, the bad guy's lair, I think it's called The Undertaker. It's 100% the mill, and all kinds of cool paint effects were used to. It's funny because we've invested so much into restoring some of these old buildings, but for that shoot, quite a few layers of special effects were added to age the site even more. Yeah. So it's like a parallel. Oh yeah, that's how bad it could have looked if we hadn't had that restoration project. Don't go in there, Sarah Michelle Gellar. It's not safe. That's a fun one. I think that one's pretty safe for the kids.
That's awesome. I mean, this building is truly breathtaking. I mean, if you haven't had a chance and you're driving by on your way to Squamish or Whistler, it's something it's a must-see. It really is.
And the great part about the Britannia Mine Museum team that we have right now is that we're an organization that's still growing, still moving forward. Oh. And although we're focused on telling the stories of the past, we're always searching for new angles to put different spins on that material, to give people a different experience year after year when they come to see us. We feel tremendously grateful for the support that we've seen, not just from the local community, but when travel restrictions were lifted, from people from other parts of British Columbia, people from other parts of Canada, and when borders finally reopened, from those international audiences as well. But we've seen our membership base swell significantly, which tells me that many folks who are in the area have an intent not only of having to come see the space, in many cases for the first time since maybe they took a field trip when they were kids, but they're interested in coming back too. Yeah. For that reason, I highly encourage everybody to follow us on social media. We're at Britannia Mine Museum on all platforms, and BritanniaMineMuseum.ca is our main web hub. And if you subscribe to our channels, you'll see cool temporary displays that are going up on a regular basis as we continue to grow and change the museum experience.
And I'll put all that information on the bottom here as well.
Fantastic. So, yeah, click the link below.
Yeah. So people can see where to go, go to the website, and just, it's very interactive. You get to see, and even following them on Instagram. I mean, it's great seeing some of the clips that are out there, you guys explaining things, and it's awesome. It really is.
Aww,
you guys are just, you're killing it. You really are.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl. It's such a pleasure to be able to represent for such an amazing organization that is part of such an incredible community with an amazing history. And to be able to carry that forward into the future is something that none of us here take for granted.
I mean, this is what people are seeing, right? This is all they're seeing. They don't get to sit there and see, I can only see probably a good, 10, maybe 8 stories up. But it just keeps going.
I've always thought this would be a really cool spot to do wedding photos.
Oh, yeah.
So if I'm going to inception that out there, if anybody's looking for some crazy views, send us a message. If you can find a photographer who's down, maybe we'll see what we can do when the light's nice and glowy like this. If that's not in the cards, though, I also want to tell you about our upcoming exhibit, which is going to be opening up on October 1st in just a couple of weeks. So one of our buildings is known as the Terra Lab. It was previously the space where, when the mine was open, rock samples would be examined to figure out the concentration of the copper. And we've tried to keep the spirit of that alive by turning the space into an area for STEAM learning, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, if you're not familiar with the acronym. So in addition to lots of classrooms being there, we have some dynamic displays that will be coming up. And we recently just struck up a partnership with my good friends at the Strawberry Isle Marine Research Society, which operates in Tofino, doing work with marine life in that area, and with the BD Biodiversity Museum out at UBC, which has extensive biological collections, as well as the Porpoise Conservation Society, a local not-for-profit organization that studies some of the most unusual and unknown marine mammals that are found right in Howe Sound.
Wow.
And together, our collaboration will explore the mine's impact on the diversity of Howe Sound and how the water treatment plant that I talked about earlier has been successful at removing the impacts of acid rock drainage from that sensitive food chain. The exhibit is going to be called Ore and Orcas, the Remediation of Howe Sound. And it will run from October 1st until October 31st. And the centerpiece is a real killer whale skeleton that is going to be placed in the Terra Lab just for that 1 month. It's
Cool.
a very cool opportunity, and I think can help to put a little more of a biological face on the problems that we faced and just what kinds of animals had to gain from the amazing remediation work that's gone on since the mid-2000s and has brought this particular stretch of Howe Sound back to being a biodiverse place.
Well, now that the borders are open for Americans to cross, I mean, this is a great spot for them to come and see some of the history of BC. Truly amazing. Honestly, I know you got to get going here. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this beautiful building.
Well, it's my pleasure, Daryl. Thank you so much again for bringing the Vancity Adventure team out to see us. Come back anytime. And I look forward to meeting some of you viewers when you're next coming on one of my train rides.
That's awesome. Thanks. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Don't forget again to subscribe and follow below. And if you're interested in more from Britannia Mine Museum, check out britanniaminemuseum.ca.
Thanks, guys. See you guys later. Bye.